A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey, Herman and Corin. So we've talked about blue light filtering before in episodes about circadian rhythm and circadian health, and we've looked at blue light filtering predominantly from the lens of we want to have less blue light at nighttime to make it easier to fall asleep. We want to avoid interfering with melatonin production. But something that we also mentioned in those episodes is that's important, yes, but it's also important on the flip side to deliberately expose yourself to blue light in the morning in order to cue your brain into knowing that this is morning, the opposite end of the picture. Now, for blue light filtering, for many years, I've actually used a always on blue light filter. And that's, I just realized now and again, I remember I have it because I need to record my screen for a YouTube video sometimes. And if I don't remember to turn it off, I notice the screen looks orange on my video. I'm using always on at 2800 Kelvin, and I noticed that the parameters, if I go fully warm, that's 1000 Kelvin. That's as far as this goes on KDE, and that's like impossible to use. It's essentially the screen is a dark red. 6500 is zero filtering whatsoever, and these are usually the same parameters, same Kelvin values, more or less, that you see on smart home light bulbs, where you can set the Kelvin value for an indoor light. My question, Herman and Corin, is firstly the wisdom of having it always on. I suspect that based on what you've taught me in your episodes, this is actually a bad idea. I'll tell you the reason I don't like those settings where the blue light thing kind of follows the sun. Because I do quite a bit of video and photo editing, when the blue light offset is changing perceptibly, especially around sundown, it starts to like increment, and I find that a bit distracting because it's quite a jump between increments, and it's also sometimes hard when you're editing footage and suddenly it's very hard to color correct when you've got that going on, those changes. I personally like the idea of maybe a just simple 2-mode setting better, where you have night mode and day mode. And my questions, Herman and Corin, are firstly regarding the always on blue light filtering, if that's a good idea or a bad idea. And the second one is the actual Kelvin value. I think I landed on 2800 Kelvin just by kind of toggling that thing until it felt like it was significantly easier on my eyes. My goals, besides the circadian aspect, is to have a screen that is less bothersome or less harsh. So I also turned down the brightness quite a bit. And again, this is one of those things where I'm guessing you don't want to go too far doing that either, because it'll be harder to see a screen like that. The final thing to round off this discussion, Herman and Corin, because there is another world of hardware blue light filters that we could talk about. That's another avenue people can take. But at the software level, the other thing that's become a lot more popular in recent years is dark mode. And I think sometimes it's just an aesthetic. People like that kind of very hacker in a dungeon kind of look to their computer. But in other cases, I've heard people saying they find it much easier on their eyes. So I'd love to know, Herman and Corin, if you were advising someone, me or any of our listeners, upon a good Kelvin setting and the best way to use these, and whether dark mode actually does make a difference, what would you recommend? Herman and Corin, let's talk about using software for blue light mitigation in today's episode of My Weird Prompts.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. It is February 26, 2026, and I am Corin. I am sitting here with my brother Herman, and today we are getting into the technical weeds of something that most of us spend at least 8 to 10 hours a day staring at. We are talking about the photons hitting your retinas right now.
Herman Poppleberry here. And honestly, Corin today is a bit of a meta day for us because we are literally looking at the very screens we are about to critique. Today's prompt comes from Daniel, who is writing to us from Jerusalem. Daniel has a very specific setup that he has been using for a while, but he is starting to second guess the science behind it. He is a photo and video editor, and for the sake of his eyes, he has been using an always-on blue light filter set to 2800 Kelvin.
2800 Kelvin. For those who do not have a color temperature chart handy, that is incredibly warm. That is the color of a sunset or an old-school incandescent light bulb. It is very yellow, almost orange. Daniel says he uses this static setting because he finds dynamic filters, the ones that shift the color temperature as the sun goes down, to be incredibly distracting for his workflow. He is wondering if this always-on approach is actually doing him more harm than good, and he also wants to know if dark mode is actually a health benefit or just a hacker aesthetic.
It is a fantastic prompt because it hits that perfect intersection of professional standards, human biology, and daily utility. Daniel is trying to solve a real problem, digital eye strain, but he might be accidentally sabotaging his own biological clock and his professional accuracy in the process. We have touched on the circadian side of things back in episode 850, but Daniel's situation adds a layer of professional complexity that we really need to unpack.
Let's start with the biology, because that is the foundation of the blue light is evil, narrative that has taken over the tech world in the last decade. Herman, we have talked about the morning blue light being a good thing. Why is Daniel's 2800 Kelvin filter potentially a problem at 10 o'clock in the morning?
It comes down to a very specific part of our anatomy that was only really understood in the last 25 years or so. We all know about rods and cones for seeing shapes and colors. But we also have these things called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, or IPRGCs. These cells do not help you see the image on the screen. Instead, they contain a photopigment called melanopsin, which is specifically tuned to detect short wavelength light, specifically in the 480 nanometer range. That is the blue part of the spectrum.
And these cells are basically the light sensors for our internal master clock, right?
They send signals directly to the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain. When those cells detect blue light, they tell the brain, hey, it is daytime. Suppress the melatonin and start pumping out the cortisol. This sets your anchor for the entire 24-hour cycle. It regulates your alertness, your metabolism, and even your mood. Now, here is the problem for Daniel. By keeping his monitor at 2800 Kelvin all day, he is effectively starving those IPRGCs of their primary stimulus. Even if it is high noon in Jerusalem and the sun is blazing outside, his primary visual focus is telling his brain that it is a perpetual sunset.
So he is essentially living in a state of physiological twilight. I can imagine that would lead to some serious brain fog or afternoon slumps. If your brain never gets that clear blue sky signal, it never fully enters high-performance mode.
Precisely. There is a reason why high-end corporate offices invest millions in lighting systems that stay at 5,000 or 6,000 Kelvin during the day. It promotes cognitive function and focus. By locking himself into 2800 Kelvin, Daniel is intentionally reducing his contrast and his blue light exposure during the very hours when he needs it most for alertness. It is like trying to run a marathon while your body thinks it is time for a bedtime story.
But Daniel's concern is the harshness of the screen. He mentioned he turned the brightness down and shifted the temperature to make it easier on his eyes. We need to distinguish between circadian health and digital eye strain, because they are not the same thing, even though they get lumped together in marketing for blue light glasses.
That is a huge distinction to make. Digital eye strain, or what doctors call computer vision syndrome, is rarely caused by the color of the light itself. It is caused by two main factors, blink rate and accommodation. When we stare at a digital screen, our blink rate drops by about 60 to 70%. We just stop blinking because we are focused. That dries out the ocular surface. Accommodation refers to the tiny ciliary muscles in your eye that have to constantly flex to keep that digital image in focus.
So the ache Daniel feels isn't necessarily because the light is blue. It is because his eye muscles are doing a heavy workout without any breaks.
Now, blue light does scatter more easily than longer wavelengths. That is why the sky is blue, a phenomenon called Rayleigh scattering. This scattering can create a bit of visual noise or a slight haze, which can reduce perceived contrast. By shifting to 2800 Kelvin, Daniel is increasing the long wavelength light, which is easier for the eye to focus on. So, it might feel more comfortable in the short term, but he is paying a massive price for that comfort.
Let's talk about that price, specifically for a photo and video editor. This is the part of the problem that really jumped out at me. If you are color grading a video at 2800 Kelvin, you are essentially wearing orange-tinted goggles while trying to paint a masterpiece.
It is a recipe for disaster, Corn. In the industry, the standard for color accurate work is D65, which is 6500 Kelvin. That is the white point that almost all professional monitors are calibrated to. If Daniel is editing at 2800 Kelvin, his brain is going to go through something called chromatic adaptation. His brain will eventually try to convince him that the yellow-orange screen is actually neutral.
Right. So if he sees a photo that is actually a perfect neutral white, it will look yellow to him on his filtered screen. So what does he do? He adds blue to the image to make it look white to his eyes.
And then he exports that file and someone opens it on a standard iPhone or a calibrated MacBook Pro and the image looks like a frozen tundra. It will be incredibly blue shifted. This is why professional editors spend thousands of dollars on calibration hardware like the Calibrite Display Plus. You cannot trust your eyes if your baseline is shifting. By using an always-on 2800 Kelvin filter, Daniel has essentially rendered his professional work non-standard. He is guessing, not knowing.
He mentioned that the dynamic shifting is distracting, which I totally get. If you are in the middle of a 3-hour edit and the screen slowly turns orange, your perception of color is drifting while you work. That is a nightmare. But his solution of always orange seems just as problematic for the final product.
It really is. If he wants to be a professional, he needs a stable, calibrated environment. If I were in his shoes, I would look at the environment first. Daniel is in Jerusalem, which has some of the most intense natural light in the world. If he is working in a dark room with a 2800 Kelvin screen, the contrast between the screen and the room is what is killing his eyes.
We talked about this in episode 828 regarding triple monitor setups, the importance of bias lighting.
Instead of slamming the monitor temperature down to 2800 Kelvin, he should put a 6500 Kelvin LED strip behind his monitor. This is called bias lighting. It illuminates the wall behind the screen with a neutral white light. This does two things. First, it constricts the pupil slightly, which increases the perceived sharpness of the screen. Second, it provides a reference white for his brain. It reduces the strain caused by the high contrast of a bright screen in a dark room without messing with the actual color data of his project.
That is such a better solution. It addresses the physical comfort without sabotaging the color accuracy. But what about the blue light at night issue? If he has a deadline and he is working at 10 p.m., he still has that 6500 Kelvin light hitting his retinas and keeping him awake.
That is where the toggle comes in. Daniel, if you are listening, stop using a gradual transition. Use a binary switch. Most professional monitors, and even software like DisplayCal, allow you to have different profiles. During your work hours, you stay at 6500 Kelvin. You need that for your brain and your accuracy. Once the professional work is done, and you are just browsing the web or answering emails, hit a hotkey and switch to your Relax profile at 2800 Kelvin.
It is like having a work mode and a home mode for your eyes. I think the mistake people make is trying to find one setting that works for 24 hours, but our biology isn't static. We are designed for high contrast light environments.
Precisely. And speaking of settings, let's tackle the second part of Daniel's question, dark mode. This has become almost a religious war in the tech community. Is it actually better for your eyes, or is it just for the hacker aesthetic, as Daniel put it?
I remember when dark mode first became a system-wide feature on Mac OS and Windows. People acted like it was the greatest health innovation since the discovery of vitamins. But the actual research on legibility and eye strain is a bit more nuanced, isn't it?
It is very nuanced, and in many cases, it is actually counterintuitive. There is a phenomenon called halation. When you have white text on a black background, the light from the white letters tends to bleed into the surrounding dark pixels. This is especially problematic for the millions of people who have even a slight astigmatism. It makes the text look blurry or glowy, which actually increases the cognitive load required to read it.
I have definitely noticed that. If I am reading a long article in dark mode, my eyes feel like they are working harder to grip the words.
That is because they are ours working harder. In light mode, which is black text on a white background, there is more overall light entering the eye. This causes the pupil to constrict. Just like a camera lens, a smaller aperture or a smaller pupil results in a deeper depth of field and a sharper image on the retina. When you use dark mode, your pupil dilates to let in more light. This wider aperture makes it harder for the eye to maintain a sharp focus, leading to more spherical aberration.
So, for long-form reading, like a script or a long email, light mode is actually objectively better for visual acuity.
Generally, yes. Most studies show that reading performance is higher and fatigue is lower with positive polarity, which is dark text on a light background. However, there is a catch. In a very dark room, a bright white screen can be physically painful because the contrast is too high. This is where dark mode shines. It reduces the luminous flux, or the total amount of light hitting your eye, which prevents that flash blindness feeling.
So it is an environmental tool. If you are in a bright office, use light mode. If you're in a dark bedroom at midnight, use dark mode.
But Daniel mentioned he is a photo and video editor. In that world, dark mode is actually a functional requirement, but for a different reason. It is about simultaneous contrast. If you have a bright white border around a photo you are editing, your brain will perceive the photo as being darker and less saturated than it actually is. By using a dark gray or black interface, you allow your eyes to see the true luminosity and saturation of the image.
So for the tools, dark mode is great. For the content, it depends on the environment. But Herman, I read a study recently. I think it was from 2024 suggesting that long-term exclusive use of dark mode might actually contribute to myopia or nearsightedness. Is there any truth to that?
There is some emerging research on that, and it is fascinating. The theory is that because dark mode keeps the pupil more dilated, it might signal the eye to grow longer over time, which is the physical cause of myopia. Bright light, especially natural sunlight, triggers dopamine release in the retina, which helps maintain the correct shape of the eyeball. By living in a dark mode world all day, we might be depriving our eyes of the signals they need to stay healthy.
That is a huge point. So Daniel, sitting in Jerusalem, should probably be opening his curtains and letting that Mediterranean light in during the day, rather than hiding behind a 2800 Kelvin filter and a dark mode interface.
Daniel, if you want to protect your eyes in your sleep, the best thing you can do is get 10 to 15 minutes of direct sunlight as soon as you wake up. That will set your circadian clock much more effectively than any software filter. Then, during your workday, use a calibrated 6500 Kelvin setting with a bias light behind your monitor.
And what about the 2800 Kelvin recommendation? Is there a middle ground? If he feels 6500 is too blue or harsh, is there a compromise?
5000 Kelvin is often the sweet spot for many people. It is often called cool white or horizon daylight. It takes that piercing blue edge off without making everything look like a jar of marmalade. If he wants a static setting that he can leave on all day without destroying his color accuracy too much, 5000 Kelvin is a much more defensible choice than 2800.
I also want to touch on the hardware side. Daniel mentioned he is worried about his YouTube recordings showing the orange tint. That happens because he is using a software filter like f.lux or Windows Night Light. These filters literally change the data being sent from the GPU to the screen.
Right. If you take a screenshot while f.lux is on, the screenshot is orange. That is a huge problem for a video editor. The pro solution here is to use a monitor with hardware-level calibration or a low blue light mode that is handled by the monitor's internal scaler, not the software. High-end monitors from companies like BenQ or ISO have TUV Rhineland certified hardware filters that reduce the blue light peak without shifting the entire image to orange.
And if he uses a hardware profile, he can record his screen and the recording will stay perfectly neutral because the filter is happening at the physical glass level, not the software level.
It solves the YouTube recording problem and the color accuracy problem in one go. It is a bit of an investment, but for someone doing professional work, it is a game changer.
We should also talk about the 20-20-20 rule again. We mention it a lot, but for someone like Daniel, who is clearly very concerned about eye health, it is the most effective tool in the kit.
It really is. Every 20 minutes, look at something 20 feet away for at least 20 seconds. This allows the ciliary muscles, the ones that are clenched to focus on your monitor, to finally relax. It is like stretching your legs after a long flight. No amount of blue light filtering or dark mode can replace the need for your eyes to change their focal point.
It is interesting how we try to solve these biological problems with software, when the solution is often just looking out a window.
We are a very nearsighted society now, both literally and figuratively. We spend our lives looking at things within arm's reach. Our eyes evolved to scan the horizon for predators or prey. When we lock them onto a glowing rectangle for 12 hours, we are asking them to do something they weren't designed for. The fatigue Daniel feels is his body's way of saying, hey, give me a break.
So, to recap for Daniel, first, the 2800 Kelvin, always on setting, is likely causing a circadian mismatch. It is making his brain think it is sunset all day, which can lead to fatigue and low mood. Second, it is absolutely destroying his professional color accuracy. He should move toward a 6500 Kelvin or 5000 Kelvin baseline for work.
Third, he should invest in a bias light, a neutral white LED strip behind the monitor to reduce eye strain without messing with color. Fourth, use dark mode as an environmental tool, not a health mandate. If the room is bright, use light mode for better text sharpness. And fifth, get some real sunlight in the morning to anchor that internal clock.
It is about light hygiene. We think about dental hygiene and sleep hygiene, but we rarely think about the quality of the photons we are consuming.
It is a great way to put it. You wouldn't eat the same thing for every meal, and you shouldn't consume the same light all day. You need the protein of blue light in the morning and the fiber of warm light in the evening.
Daniel also mentioned his son, Ezra, and his wife, Hannah. When you have a young child, your sleep is already under siege. You don't want to be making it worse by confusing your brain with your monitor settings. If Daniel is filtering blue light all day, he might find it harder to wake up when Ezra wakes him up at 6 in the morning.
That is a very real factor. The contrast between day and night is what makes the system work. If you flatten that curve by using a warm filter all day, your body loses its rhythm. You want that big spike of blue in the morning so that when you finally turn it off at night, your brain actually notices the difference and starts producing melatonin.
This has been a really deep dive into the physics of how we work. I feel like I need to go recalibrate my own monitors now.
I think we all do. It is easy to set these things once and forget about them, but as our work habits change, our settings should too. And Daniel, seriously, look into that bias lighting. It is the single most underrated upgrade for any creative professional. It makes the screen feel like it is floating in the room rather than stabbing your eyes.
Well, I think that covers Daniel's prompt. It is a lot to take in, but the takeaway is clear. Use light as a tool, not just a background setting.
And thanks to Daniel for such a thoughtful question. It is rare that we get to talk about IPRGCs and color grading in the same breath.
If you are listening, and you have a weird prompt about the tech you use, the way your body works, or the intersection of the two, send it our way. We are always looking for new rabbit holes to jump down.
You can find us at myweirdprompts.com, where we have an archive of all our past episodes. We have covered everything from the red light revolution in episode 712 to the physics of triple monitor setups.
You can also email us directly at show@myweirdprompts.com. We read every single email, even if we can't get to them all on the air.
And if you are enjoying the show, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It genuinely helps other curious people find us, and it helps us keep the lights on, preferably at 6500 Kelvin.
Nice one, Herman. Also, a quick shout out to the music you hear at the start and end of the show. That is all generated with Suno, which is just mind-blowing to me. The tools we have in 2026 are just incredible.
They really are. Well, I think my eyes have had enough of this screen for one session.
Same here. Let's go find a window. Thanks for listening to My Weird Prompts. I am Corn.
And I am Herman Poppleberry. We will see you next time.
Stay curious, everyone. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and